Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. We'll let a few more people trickle in. We can probably get started. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this wonderful program, Wanderer and Its Legacy, a conversation with Margie Scoby. Before we get to what you're all here to see, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping and then provide you with a very brief overview of the Addison's quite remarkable model ship collection and discuss how a work by the British Nigerian artist Yinka Shonibare ended up in the collection of the Addison Gallery of American Art. This program is being recorded, so feel free to check our website in about a week or so for the recording, and feel free to share it as widely as you'd like. And also, the chat is not going to be monitored, but if you do have questions, feel free to submit them through the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to address them at the end of our program. So without further ado, my name is Gordon Wilkins. I'm the Robert M. Walker Curator of American Art here at the Addison. And I'm going to just give you a little bit of an introduction into the Addison's model ship collection, which no doubt if you've visited the Addison, you're probably well aware that we have a pretty remarkable collection of 25 model ships. This it might seem like an odd choice to have a collection of model ships at a museum dedicated to American art that really doesn't have a maritime collection. We don't really have much of a decorative arts collection to speak of. But our collection does include these remarkable works of art that were created really with the exception of Yinka Shonibare's Wanderer, were created within a very abbreviated time period from around 1930 to around 1936. And this was really the vision, this model ship collection was really the vision of James Sawyer, who was the trustee of Phillips Academy, who rather was a treasurer of Phillips Academy and a very close friend of Thomas Cochrane, the Addison's founder. Sawyer thought that it would be a good idea to assemble a collection of model ships. And I have this quote where he states, "We have no ambition to have a large number of models. We did start out with a definite program of examples representing the different eras of merchant and naval ships. We do not pretend to rival Salem, meaning what is now the Peabody Essex Museum, or certain other museums, but the Addison Gallery wishes to impress upon the boys' minds and the beauty of the sailing ship and its contribution to the growth and prosperity of this country." So the model ship program, as it were, came about out of this desire to be able to have these tangible connections, tangible manifestations of America's celebrated maritime heritage. It was a very complicated and expensive process to assemble this collection. Each ship was made by a different maker. There are some that overlap, but really there were model ship makers who specialized in particular ships. So it's not as though they picked these out of a catalog. These were chosen very deliberately based on a desire to have this kind of cross-section of ships that could tell this larger story. So the image that I have on the screen right now is the ship model room, which is Gallery 109. So it's the first gallery that you see when you come into the museum, into the rotunda, and you look straight back. We still refer to it as the model ship gallery, which I think confuses particularly new employees because there haven't been model ships there for decades. But it was once dedicated exclusively to the display of our model ship collection. The ship collection is now displayed largely downstairs in our basement level. And it provides you the opportunity to see these model ships in dialogue with each other. I'll also note that a lot of this information that I'm presenting comes from a book that was published in the 1960s called Models of American Sailing Ships, drawn from the collection of the Addison Gallery of American Art. Unfortunately, it's out of print, but we do have copies here at the Addison. You can find them online if you're really interested. It's quite an engaging and often quite funny book because it gets into a lot of the sort of interpersonal dynamics that existed between the various model ship makers, many of whom were themselves old sailors. So they were very salty gentlemen for the most part, many of whom had a very strong dislike or distrust of the affluent. And of course, Phillips Academy being this great symbol of American ruling class, they were a little bit suspicious about their engagement with Phillips Academy. But anyway, they were quite, there's some quite remarkable correspondence. One thing that unites all of these model ships is that they were all made at the same scale. So it's a 1/4 inch to 1 foot scale. And that was very deliberate on the part of James Sawyer and Thomas Cochrane. They wanted young boys. At the time, Phillips Academy was an all-boys school up until 1974. They wanted their primary audience, the young men of Andover, to be able to learn by looking, to be able to stand in a room with these ships and scan them to see relative scales and sizes. So since they're all at the same scale, you really can get an incredible appreciation of just how minuscule the Mayflower was, for example, compared to J.P. Morgan's Corsair, which, of course, these photos don't quite do it justice. But you can actually see in the galleries or in the basement where the ships are normally held, the relative scales. And you can imagine, just how terrifying it would have been to have been on the Mayflower. The other thing that I'll note is that these models were built up, which is that they did not start from a solid hull that was then sort of adorned or decorated. They're built very much like an actual ship would have been built. And the attention to detail that was demonstrated in their construction, I could say confidently, was fanatical. There were great arguments. For example, I have a small detail image of America, which was the inaugural defender, the first defender of the America's Cup. You can see the sheeting, the copper sheeting that's at the hull of the ship. Sawyer thought that this was too sloppy, but then the maker of the ship actually argued that in real life, the actual application of the copper sheeting was sloppy and that he would not change it because he really wanted historical accuracy. So verisimilitude and accuracy is really the name of the game. For example, in the Dreadnought, you can see into a cabin, which I don't have a great photo of, unfortunately, but when you come and see the models in person, if you peer through those doors, you can actually see furnished cabins with bunk beds that have red flannel sheets on them. There's a brass cuspidor mahogany fittings also on the Dreadnought. So these were really deluxe, extraordinarily expensive models. The Claremont, for example, known as the first steamship, has an operational steamship or steam engine rather. We haven't tested that, but I'm assured that we could turn it on if we so wanted to, probably destroy the entire model. And you can also see the Thatcher Magoon with its incredible attention to detail, even going down, extending to the figureheads, which are in perfect scale and really exquisitely carved. The model ship collection was largely a closed collection until just a few years ago, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't activated or hasn't been activated. Even though it typically resides in our basement, model ships have been brought upstairs on many occasions and have been the subject of their own exhibitions. Here I have three exhibitions over the past 20 or so years, 30 or so years that have really highlighted the model ship collection. 1/4 scale models of American sailing ships in 1994, models as Muse in 2007, which was an exhibition that invited contemporary artists to respond to our model ship collection. Pictured are two incredible dioramas by the artist David Opdyke. And then currently we have an exhibition called Sea Change, which was just extended. It will be up through the end of this weekend. So I do urge you to come and see it if you have the opportunity. And this exhibition allowed us to bring a number of model ships up from the basement, allow people to walk around them, get a really close in-depth look at these model ships in 3D and really appreciate their scale and their incredible beauty. This show was organized as a complement to a show that unfortunately just closed, Reggie Burroughs Hodges Turning a Big Ship. And it it contains choice examples from the Addison's really significant collection of work related to the American maritime tradition. There are 4 maiden galleries, each dealing with a different facet, and each gallery is really anchored by an exceptional model ship from our collection. So I do urge you to come see it. One of the model ships on display is Yinka Shonibare's Wanderer. So the Addison is very explicitly a museum of American art. And in the terms of trust that we have to abide by, that was drafted in 1930 by our founder, Thomas Cochrane, he delineates exactly the parameters of the Addison's collection. And essentially, we can show anything we want by an artist of any nationality or cultural affiliation. But in order for a work of art to enter into the permanent collection, the artist responsible for the piece has to have either been a native born or naturalized US citizen, which is a very restrictive definition of American that is almost unique to the Addison, and one that's quite historically informed by the era in which the Terms of Trust was written. But that's a conversation for a later day. But I'll mention that we do have loopholes in our Terms of Trust. So it does state that the Terms of Trust states that the Addison Gallery shall only house painting, sculpture, silver, and other works of art or craftsmanship produced by a native-born or naturalized citizen of the United States. To this condition, there may be the following exceptions, namely temporary loan exhibits and photographs and books produced or by authors other than native-born or naturalized citizens of the United States. Likewise, this is the important part, there may be housed in the Addison Gallery scale models of famous ships connected with the history of the United States. So while this collection was really closed, or we weren't adding to the collection after the 24th model ship was completed in the early 1930s, there was this incredible opportunity presented to the Addison to add to our model ship collection. The Addison's model ship collection, as I mentioned, was always envisioned to not be fully comprehensive, but to provide a really important overview of the maritime history of the United States. It was particularly glaring, that being said, that there was no slave ship represented in the Addison's model ship collection. That we were able to rectify that major omission in 2016 through the acquisition of Yinka Shonibare's Wanderer, which we have a photo of here, and it's on display in one of the front four galleries as part of Sea Change currently. And when it's not on display there, it is on display with the rest of the model ships in the basement. This is the very first model ship to be added to the collection in over 80 years. And what's remarkable about it is that it's was built to the same scale as the rest of the collection. So this was not a custom produced work. This is actually an editioned work, a fairly small edition, I believe 4 examples, that was produced by Yinka Shonibare in 2006. Yinka Shonibare, as I mentioned, is a Nigerian British artist who is known for his really politically engaged works that interrogate the legacies of colonialism. And one of his signature aesthetic devices is his utilization of Dutch wax print fabric, which is drawn, it's an adaptation of Southeast Asian batiks. And while we associate these patterns and these fabrics with Africa, they were actually introduced to Africa by the Dutch. So it's this really complicated story of cultural exchange, appropriation embodied in these fabrics, which we typically tend to think in a kind of a unilateral or one-way. We sort of think of how colonizing powers took from the colonized. In this case, this is kind of plays with our typical association of the impact of colonialism, and looking at how African societies have appropriated these Dutch textiles and really transformed them into something that is considered by many to be a cultural product of Africa. So he utilizes those fabrics. Some people have asked on tours, and I hope that they're joking, but I can never be sure. People think that this is a historically accurate model in the sense that this slave ship actually had this clandestine slave ship had such bold and vibrant cotton print sails. This is artistic license, but it is all built to the same scale, the 1/4 inch scale, and is this once in a lifetime perfect addition to the Addison's collection that both filled a major gap and really amplified our ability to tell the story of the American seafaring tradition. So with that, I'll leave you with a really enticing detail. It's a beautiful work of art, and I really encourage you to come to the Addison to see it. I'll leave you with this teaser, and I'll turn the podium over to Rachel Vogel, our assistant curator, who will introduce Margie. So I'll leave it
Thanks,
to Rachel.
So I'm Rachel Vogel, assistant curator here at the Addison, and I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Margie Scoby. Margie is the founder and curator for the Finding Our Roots African American Museum in Houma, Louisiana. She was raised on the Bayou of Terrebonne in Louisiana and has spent her life serving her community. She worked for the Lafourche Parish government as a right-of-way servitude coordinator and was one of the first African American women to hold that position. She's also worked for the Terrebonne Parish School System, the McKinley-Vento Homeless Program, the Department of Health and Hospitals, and the Emergency Management for the Archdiocese of Houma-Thibodaux. She worked for Louisiana Spirit and received an award for her artistic work, where she wrote and performed puppet shows that were used throughout the region as a form of therapy for children who suffered from traumatic stress. She also volunteered her time and services with Meaningful Minds, an organization that helps those who deal with mental illness. She received an award from AmeriCorps for serving as an outstanding leader in her community, and she currently serves on the board of Houma Area Convention and Visitors Bureau as secretary and treasurer, and serves as vice president for the Terrebonne Parish Women's Day Association. Margie has played a critical role in researching and presenting the history of her community through extensive archival and genealogical research. In February 2017, she founded the Finding Our Roots African American Museum, and in 2021, the museum reopened post-COVID with the exhibition Blood, Sweat, and Tears, which told the story of the slave ship Wanderer. Margie herself is a descendant of one of the hundreds of people brought illegally to the United States on the Wanderer. When the original museum building was damaged in Hurricane Ida, Margie purchased, stripped down, and remodeled a mobile unit and launched the first African-American mobile museum in the state of Louisiana. She's also been instrumental to several other historical research initiatives. She was hired by the Terrebonne Parish Tourist Commission to research the history of the African Americans of Terrebonne and Lafourche Parish. She completed the history of the former Southdown High and brought to light the history of the first 4 African American children to enter an all-white school in 1966, and both schools now bear a plaque marking Margie's research. On the occasion of the Terrebonne Bicentennial celebration, she, along with others in town, put together the lost history of the parish, and Margie invited descendants of Frederick Douglass, Sally Hemings, and Thomas Jefferson to take part in the presentation. She has worked with Georgetown University in their efforts researching the sale of 272 slaves, and she continues to help others research their family history and find the missing link to their family. She received the Terrebonne Parish Pioneer of the Year Award. She formed and was elected president of the first African American research group in the parish, and she received the 2023 NAUW Award for Distinguished Woman. Margie, it is such an honor and pleasure to have you here with us today. I'll turn it over now to tell the story of the Wanderer, and then we will come back and speak a bit more about your work and research. Margie, over to you.
I am the voice of my ancestors. I got started with the Wanderer. Decided on doing an exhibit called Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Upon doing so, I stumbled across a piece that mentioned William as a slave that was captured and brought in on the slave ship Wanderer. And he told details on what happened. Well, after completing my research, I did find William and Robert was actually those 2 slaves that was brought to Lafourche Parish. They were brought in, I'm not sure, I think I'm having problems here. They were brought in on the Wanderer. And of course, Robert mentioned it in details as to what happened. I think I'm having something that's going on here. I'm not sure. Can you hear me, Rachel?
Yep, we hear you just fine.
Okay, all right, fine. Just see a big blog, that's why I'm just asking. But anyway, it goes back to my curiosity. Of course, I know I'm a descendant of the Prince Abdul Rahman Sori, who was also the Prince of Africa. Upon stumbling across this piece on the Wanderer, it came about not only doing this exhibit, but a lady called and asked about a sign, advertising sign that was in the yard. Like, what are we doing about that sign? Are we getting any royalties as a result? So I looked up the sign. I found out that the the owners was Lamar. So looked up Lamar, and sure enough, Lamar ties into the actual slave ship my ancestors came in on. Of course, I continue to dig further to find out concrete evidence on did Robert make it here and how. Went in the genealogy or the records at Lafourche Parish, and I found the sale of Robert. He was actually sold by a guy named Pugh. Pugh bought him in from New Orleans, he and his brother, and he sold him here for $800. That shook me for a minute, because I mean, you see them, but when you see a dollar amount, it makes it so real. And then I followed Robert. I followed Robert from Lafourche Parish, his journey from Lafourche Parish to Terrebonne Parish, and then finally to his gravesite. So that was the start of The Wanderer. It sparked my interest to find out a little bit more, and then I found Lee Ward and several others. And the one piece that I found that I'm still looking for, they said that was a relic of a cane, an African staff. And so I am looking for that cane. And they said it was located at one of the museums. From what I understand, it was a king that owned or had had possession of that when he was captured. I am now looking for the Thomas family, because James Thomas said that he came in on the Wanderer, and he was only a couple of parishes over, which is Assumption Parish. So I'm looking for the Thomas families to, to bring them, bring knowledge as to who they are and what happened. I have been in touch with the Lee family. And so we've been backwards and forward kind of sharing stories. And the one thing that I did find out that Lee made a special jug. And that was one of the items that he would create to at least make some money to get back to Africa. The Lamar family got in touch with Lamar. Actually, I spoke with one named Charles. He's named for Charles Lamar, the guy that actually made the sale. So I spoke with Charles Lamar, and it was odd. And the one, maybe it's 2 or 3 times we've had an opportunity to sit down and, kind of go over some things like what our feelings or our thoughts on what happened and how did it transpire. So one of the things Charles did, I think on our last conversation, he actually sent an email and apologizing, and that too it was so touching, because we don't get that. We oftentimes, we hear that we had our ancestors who were enslaved people, but no one never comes to terms to say we are sorry. So that part was, it was welcoming. I thank them so much for that. And then the story of the Wanderer goes, when you think everybody that's connected, it's mind-blowing. Abe Lincoln's brother-in-law gets killed as a result. Buchanan is tied into the family. Lamar, all of these people are connected. So it makes it, I understand now why it was so impossible for us as African-American enslaved people to get out of slavery. Knowing the story, I did know a lot of it, but that made it so real. Like, why in the world? How in the world? That this country allows so much of this to happen. And of course, at the time the Wanderer was brought in, they had clearly signed, they signed an agreement stating that they're not to bring any more in. But the Wanderer, that particular slave ship was the outbreak of the war, the Civil War. So with my family and other families that came in from the Wanderer, I think it's important that they know and learn because of what happened with the trade of these families, that we should be able to tell our story. Say what happened, express what you feel. And I think another thing is, I think it's important that maybe if the Lamar family would come in agreement to allow some of the descendants' families to be able to attend universities, somehow maybe work something out in the communities, because the African American community, we're starving. We're starving for everything, basically. So I think that's some of the things that needs to happen. I guess I wouldn't say a form of reparation, but somehow to rekindle for healing. I think that should take place. And Rachel, is that anybody have any questions?
Thanks. Do you mind telling a little bit of the story of the Wanderer? So you mentioned that this was after the importation of enslaved people was already made illegal in the United States. So what were the circumstances of the Wanderer? Can you tell us a bit more about the story behind the ship and the circumstances of its coming to the United States?
Yeah, what happened is Charles Lamar, he mentioned that he wanted to venture out to do something more because his father was into the ironworks. His father was into slaves, and also he was a banker. He actually owned a metal company or ironworks company, and so therefore, Charles Lamar, he had a greed and a need to want to bring in more slaves. And one of the things that he did mention is that if he should bring in more, the slaves can work the land, because he thought that was a need. So he went to went to the president and asked to sign apprenticeship to break that law in order to bring in some more slaves, because he felt that was a need for 1,200 more to work the area where his family owned in Georgia. And so after he didn't get that approval, he took it upon himself to go to the New York Yacht Club and purchase a ship from this guy named Johnson. He purchased this ship for $4,000. So he decided that he's going to do it. He was warned by his dad not to do it, but of course it happened. And of course he spoke with other people, joined forces with him, and let's move on it. Initially, he told him that he was going out to sail. He got the ship fitted out for slavery, to bring in slaves. So of course they left out. He got a captain to move out and bring go into Africa, making an agreement or a compromise or sales to these the rulers of Africa. But mind you, it wasn't just the rulers of Africa that was doing this. Africa was already infiltrated. They infiltrated Africa, and these was the demands that was coming in from the British and all these people that was telling them that this is what they must do. So of course they were in agreement, and so they would sell the slaves for $200. Now they did sign a treaty, and the treaty stated that if you were to bring the Africans in, you're not to enslave them. You can work them, you can make them go to war, but you cannot enslave them. So they broke that treaty. So what they did was, in order to break the treaty, they said that every African that came in, they were considered Moors. So in order to break this, you have to baptize them. So they baptized them in Catholicism. So now they're Catholics. So now you have a right to do just as you please. So what they did is they baptized them, they brought them in, and they enslaved them. So no laws are broken, no rules, they didn't go against the rules or the regulations or broke any treaties. And so that's how these Africans came in. And of course, Lamar brought them in, and he started to sell them because he was caught. The town people, those in charge, it was bought over in the town that Lamar has done this. And so now Lamar is on the edge, he needs to get rid of the Africans. And so he started distributing them, dispersing them with all his friends and relatives. And so they ended up in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and of course, Louisiana. So that's one of the ways that he got rid of.
And so how did you first begin this research process, and what were how did you begin to collect all of the information that you featured in your exhibition? Where did you visit? Who did you speak to? And what sources did you use as you're accumulating this information and researching this history?
Well, to begin with, according to the African culture, you're chosen by the elders. And therefore, my grandmother was actually, I was chosen. So it's called a griot or griot. And so she instilled in me all of these things that I needed to know in reference to my history, my people. You must learn, you must keep it in, you must tell, preserve. And so naturally it becomes a part of you. And so therefore, when it comes to research, for some odd reason, I have no problem at all finding, which is so great. I believe in my ancestors. And so therefore, I know whenever I get to a gridlock, for some odd reason, they guide me. So, and then I started the courthouses, the libraries, the churches. I speak with family members, especially the elders. I'm always, oftentimes, talking to the elders, and universities. So I go into those records as well.
You also mentioned that you had visited cemeteries. I know that the exhibition included soil from several cemeteries. Can you speak a bit more about that?
Well, when I started that exhibit, I thought the important thing was to add the soils and the soils of the known plantation. Locally in Terrebonne Parish, they had maps, and in those maps it kind of tells. And pretty much we also have areas that would say Southdown Plantation, Woodlawn Ranch Plantation. They still have signs as a reminder. So clearly, you know where these plantations are. If not, I usually go in and I'll ask maybe a surveyor company, do you have information on this location? And also in the courthouse, and usually they'll have a location, or you can go on the maps in the courthouse, and there's areas. So that's where I started. I started with knowing the area, knowing Terrebonne Parish for certain. Lafourche Parish, it was a little challenging, but of course, getting in with the university, Nichols University, I was able to find the areas of those plantations. And then I go in, and if the property is available, I could just walk in, grab some sorrels. I went, I grabbed the sorrels, put them in a jar. Had an opportunity to meet with Dr. Grisham, and he, with Southdown Agriculture, decided to help us with preserving the sorrels. So they went through a process, and upon that, then we put in, that's how we were able to preserve the sorrels. And then also speaking to families that tied in, I was able to get pictures. So that was one of them.
So I know through this research, you've been able to connect with other descendants of enslaved ancestors from the Wanderer. So can you talk about those connections, what you've learned from these connections, and what in general, that experience has been like?
It's odd, it's strange. I can't explain it to a point where you can understand or feel or know what I've experienced. But I'll tell you just a little bit of something here. Lisa with Lee, the Lee family, when she called and she says, my family is descendant of the Wanderer, then I know my family is a descendant. I felt like it was a time that we, once again, those slaves that was placed on that slave ship as young boys and young women, that instantly they came together as one, as though we felt like embracing and crying. Actually, I know I shed some tears, and I can hear on the other line that, she was very emotional. Because, when you know the story and you know what happened. Now, I'm waiting on Michael to call me. Michael Lee. He's a descendant of Ward Lee. But I sent him a text message and emails, and I found out about the stick that Lee had and the jug. So some of those things is some of the things you want to touch, because then it's real. It makes it so real. And so that family I've been networking with, the Thomas family I've been reaching out to, and hopefully I can narrow them down. And then there's a couple of other families out in the Georgia area. One is, her name is Linham. And I thought initially I thought her name was Lamar, but then I looked and I found out that it is a Linham. So I've reached out to her as well. So hopefully we can all come together and bring this thing to another level.
And so this brings me to talking about the museum and the work that you've done in compiling all of this research and presenting it to the public. So can you tell us a little bit more about the process of founding the Finding Our Roots African American Museum, some of the work that you've done, and what impact you've seen that have on the community? And we have some pictures of the museum that'll come up on the screen as you're speaking.
Of course, you see the name, Finding Our Roots. The name came, my daughter decided, hey, go with the name Finding Our Roots, because I'm always looking for somebody's history, right? Somebody's family. So that's how the name came about. The museum came about after completing a contract with the Terrebonne Parish Tourist Commission. And one of the things that I asked for the parish to build a museum, an African American museum, well, I was told that was far-fetched, that chances are it would never happen. Well, I was very adamant. I felt that was a need. And so going down in prayer, asking the ancestors to push and lead and guide me, I found a building that was once owned by the African American. Matter of fact, it was one of the oldest buildings here. It was built back in 1880.
Maybe we can
by
go
the
to
African
the next
American.
slide. And
I'm sorry?
Oh, I was just saying we can go to the next slide and we can see that building.
Yes, and so I knew the history of that building and the importance of utilizing it, because at one point it was just stagnated, it was just sitting there. So I got in touch with the president of that organization, and they allowed us to use that building. And so that's how we got started. So yeah,
And
Finding Our Roots, that was a stepping stone. And of course, we're no longer in that building.
yeah, we have another. Well, actually, but before going to the next slide. So what in the original building? What are these exhibits that we're seeing? Where did you collect this information? What was on view in the original museum?
If you see the ones with the chain around the neck, that piece I'll speak about. I don't know if it's to the right or left of you, but those pieces came in on a research on slavery. So many of those pictures either is local, and if it's not local, it's either on in public domain, but it speaks about the history. Most of it is local stuff. So if you can, but that's what the one with the slaves on the coming off the ship. It depicts Africans coming in.
And then, so the museum closed, as many institutions did for COVID. If we go to the next slide. And when it reopened with this exhibition, Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Could you speak a bit more about what this exhibition consisted of, and what information is on view for visitors?
Yes, of course, you see the jars. So it started out with that, the jars, the sorrel. Collecting the sorrels from the local plantation. So if you notice, each column or each section of the jars, it's in layers. The first layer is Terrebonne Parish, and I grabbed some information about those plantation and those people that were in charge. And if you notice the bottom layer, that bottom shelf, it's those people that actually enslaved the Africans. So you'll see the pictures. I put in pictures with the story. It makes it complete. So it tells about, each of these people that were in charge here that had enslaved people. The second jar is just the areas. I didn't capture. Terrebonne Parish had 110 plantations. All of them wasn't on a large scale. Those that was on large scale, actually, they still stand in regards to now they do tours, and of course they have parties or what have you, but all the smaller plantations are no longer here. So I grabbed the soils at the top shelf. It's those local, just a few of the local, but then also I mentioned how many and who was involved, the names of those owners. The second one is Lafourche Parish, and of course that's just a small portion of them. And of course you see one say Clotilda. Now they did have a plantation here called Lamar Plantation, but unfortunately I haven't been able to find it. But it's in records that was a Lamar plantation. And of course you see Lamar on the top portion, right above the slave ship to your left. He is the key person. And of course, his dad was the one to actually give him the fundings. So that was one of the reasons we highlighted him. And of course, Laos, you'll see right below Bug Lamar. Lao is the one that had my family. So I did find, I thought it was important that we put emphasis on him. And of course, the piece that's next to Laos is the piece that talks about Robert and his brother coming in. The others is the pictures of those that came in on the Wanderer, right under the first layer of sorrow. And of course, they've been documented. And I want to think one of them name was Lucius Williams, and the others is also listed. And then you'll see a picture, actual picture of the Wanderer. So it kind of gives you an idea of what it looked like at one point. And of course, I chose a sail because from what I understood, and it was a sail, and it wasn't a typical slave ship. So he actually used a sail to disguise that purchase. And then the bottom shelf, of course, that is the list of all those people that played a role in the slave trade here in the South Louisiana.
Yeah, I think one thing that has, having the Shonibare model of the ship really makes clear is the unique circumstances of the Wanderer. That, as you mentioned, it was a yacht, a very, fancy and well-equipped yacht that was then retrofitted to illegally and surreptitiously kidnap Africans and bring them to the United States. So I think seeing that model and that sort of juxtaposition between, this fancy yacht that, had the finest linens and silverware, and then this horrible history of literally what was hidden beneath the deck really kind of speaks to this moment. And so after, I know that the museum was damaged in Hurricane Ida. And then if we could see the next slide, Finding Our Roots Museum had a new form. So can you talk to us a little bit about the mobile museum?
First day, y'all, I almost drove myself crazy, right? Because it's like, it's important to tell my history. It's important that we keep going. It's important that everybody knows what happened. And so I called my parish council. I called the Terrebonne Parish School Board. I did everything in my powers to get another building. But unfortunately, everybody was hurting. Everybody was affected by that hurricane. So, that plea kind of fell on deaf ear with everybody. So it's like, come on, you guys, I need something. So my next step was to make my car, put it on my car, and just ride around town. So after I threw in the towel, I was like, that's it. And then, of course, I do believe in the power of God. I do believe in the power of my ancestors. And so I surrendered. I was like, Lord, I'm done. If they find out who we are, they find it out. If not, I'm done. And so going through Facebook is something I usually don't, I'm not a person to kind of take in on Facebook. But some odd reason, I started looking for African relics, anything African, drums, pictures, anything African related to Africa. So I went in on that marketplace, and of course, RVs started to show up. So I'm like, I am not looking for an RV. This is not what I'm interested in. RVs kept showing. I especially put in African artifacts. RVs showed up. So it came to my heart, mind, and spirit, an RV museum. And so that's how it got started. First, we started out with just a little, matter of fact, this same bus, we started out with this mobile unit, and of course, it's a RV, it's a campus. You sleep in this thing, it's sleeping quarters. And so I told my husband, we're going to purchase this RV, and this is going to be a museum. Well, he said it can't happen. And I'm constantly, I'm threatening my husband in a good way. I'm telling him, like, listen, don't tell me what can't happen and can happen, right? And so I said, we're going to do this, and it's going to work. So we launched it in February of last year. And since that time, we've been invited all over the state of Louisiana. So it was a great idea. The wrap, what you see, the artwork that's on, it's one of the the board members, Mr. Earl Terrio, he's an artist. And that was one of the focal points in the museum, that art piece. And so what happened is, again, the Turbon Parish Tourist Commission decided to say, let's join forces and let's wrap this thing. And so we chose that piece of artwork to go on it. Because and on the opposite side, it's about I think it's Frederick Douglass, and no, it's a slave ship. I'm sorry, the slave ship with the hand of the ancestors is coming up from out of the waters. So, but that's how this got started.
And I think on the next slide we have, sorry. If we go to the next slide, we can see some images of the exhibition inside, and also clearly this has been a very popular and well-attended museum and exhibition. And so now that you have the freedom of mobility, you've been going to different places and sort of bringing the museum to different places and groups. Is that correct?
Yes. Our first visit was Nicholls State University. And Southdown Elementary School, in reference to the local area. Nicholls is in the Turbon Lafourche Parish, and we do cover tri-parish, so we do Turbon, Lafourche, and St. Mary. So, but Nicholls was our first outing. Exciting moment. What you see here is the kids of Southdown Middle School, Southdown Elementary, and Southdown was one of the historical Black schools in Turbon Parish. And so I thought it was a joy to bring it out to these kids. Matter of fact, that day we had the potato chips, because you do know George Crumb is the inventor of the potato chips. And so we know kids like, they like snacks and, that type of thing. And so we got in touch with the Crumb company, and the original chips are still being made. And so they accommodated us with 2 cases. So we were able to share that information as to who was the inventor of a chip. And then also we were able to share that delicious snack. So
is there anything else that you'd like to share? Any upcoming events or other initiatives related to the museum or related to your research?
Yes, actually, we're working on a quilt, Underground Railroad quilt, and we'll be going around the town telling the story of the Underground Railroad. There's a family here in Terrebonne that I believe that ties into Harriet Tubman, and it's just one piece of that puzzle I need to find to complete that find. But we're going to do that quilt, and also a couple of other things that we're going to try to go by doing. We're hoping to purchase a building in the near future. And with that, we're going to include the cooking, the head wraps, the history, you name it. We're going to try and put it out there and invite the public. And also the research. We're still doing research. So not only the research for my family, but I oftentimes do research for many families. And so that's one of the things we're still focusing on.
Yeah, so you're still continuing to research the descendants of the Wanderer. Is there going to be a space for this to be publicly accessible so people to aid people in researching their own history, their own ancestors, and tracing their lineage?
Yes, we're working on that as well. So many documents. I'm hoping to get the students' bodies from Nicholls to help us to get this stuff in. Digitize it, and people can go in and find it. And so many records. Oh my God, I don't think my house is large enough any longer, because there's so many documents with the list of slaves and who owned them and where they're located. And I'm hoping we can get all this stuff completed by the end of this year.
This is such a huge undertaking, an incredible initiative, and you've clearly put so much work into this project. You've overcome so many obstacles to make sure that it's visible to the public. I think in our last few minutes, we'll take some questions. Gordon, would you like to facilitate the Q&A?
So we have a few questions, and then there's one question about the model that I'll save, the Yinka Shonibare piece that I'll save for the very last question. Francis asks, what years was the Wanderer operating and how many trips did it make? I think maybe if just an outline of the main, the voyage would be really helpful and interesting to people in the audience.
I think from 1856 is when they started out. I think one of the first voyage, they went to Africa and then they managed to come in without any problems. In 1858 is when they got caught. It's when the law, came down but yeah, but I'm thinking it's two voyages the Wanderer made.
Yeah, and as you allude to, even though they were caught and this was against the law, there were no actual consequences for this illegal voyage. I think the only consequence actually was that the owners of the yacht were kicked out of the New York Yacht Club, but no actual legal consequences for this act.
And another thing I want to add, of course, I'm sure you guys are familiar with Stonewall Jackson. Of course, he inherited, or he was given that name after Buchanan sent him to New York to look for that one guy that escaped. And when he came back, they gave him the name Stonewall Jackson. Now, Stonewall was in the Confederate. And I find it kind of strange that he decided, hey, let's go after this man that brought in those slaves. And it was like, sometimes it's contradictory. It's like, wait, are you with a Confederate, but yet you're going to find someone to prosecute for bringing in a slave? And then when, in history, we learned of Stonewall Jackson, but unbeknown to me that Stonewall received the name for helping out to get this man to capture him for bringing in illegal slaves. That's like, wow, okay.
Christine asks, is it known if it was common practice to baptize Africans brought here for slavery, and did they not protest?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that there was a kind of workaround for the embargo on importing the importation of enslaved individuals, that there was a workaround by converting them or baptizing them. So I think someone wants to know if that was a common practice, this sort of baptism, and did the enslaved peoples protest their baptisms or conversions?
I want to say I seen a case at one point, but I don't think it was because of the baptizing of the slave. But I want to think that once they said something in reference to, if we are with someone free, we have a right to be free as well. But the baptism part of it, it was a common practice. And yes, no, they didn't, they had no freedom, they had no power to do anything.
Mm-hmm. Also, someone would like to know if the traveling museum ever leaves the state, or maybe if you have plans for a tour around beyond the three parishes.
Well, actually, we've been invited to the state capitol. So hopefully we'll go to Baton Rouge in a couple of weeks. And then also we've been going out to the local colleges in the other parishes. So we don't just stay local, we've been moving around.
That's great. And then, so we got a question about the Yinka Shonibare model. So I'm just going to backtrack here. So the question is, who made the ship model? Well, I'll do it in parts because there are a few questions here. Who made the ship model? So the work of art itself was envisioned, designed by Yinka Shonibare. It was fabricated, the actual model ship portion was fabricated, believe it or not, in Salem, Massachusetts, by Michael Wall, who has just recently retired from the American Marine Model Gallery, which was in Salem, then went to Gloucester, and he is known for his for being a master ship builder. The textile is there. So then, did the artist provide this information? If not, do you have this info in your records? We do. What is the meaning of the patterns in the African cloth? So again, this is not actually what the textile you see here is from a company called Vlisco, which is a Dutch-owned company, and they make what's called Dutch wax, which is what you see here. This type of fabric, this printed cotton fabric that we associate so closely with Africa and the African continent and African identity, and has been appropriated by African identity. It actually derives from the Netherlands. Over the past decades, they've started, because they understand their audience is primarily from the continent, they will send designers to population centers to get inspiration. They work with local communities to work on patterns. And so there are patterns often that reference everyday life. There's a really beautiful pattern that references oscillating fans. So, there are things that are evocative of the people who are actually purchasing, wearing, working with this fabric. The each sale, so there are as I mentioned, there are about 4 or so editions, maybe a little bit more, of this ship. The ship itself stays the same, but the sales change from edition to edition. So our combination, I don't want to say it's arbitrary, but I don't necessarily think these are standard patterns that were likely chosen for aesthetic value. That being said, I did see another version of the Wanderer in a museum, I believe in the UK, where the pattern on the sails actually is of footprints, and the museum there has interpreted it as a comment on the separation of families under the under the rule of slavery, and that families were broken apart, these sails being kind of disjointed, partially overlapping, but can also be seen as kind of fragments. That being a comment. But for our particular example, I don't know if there's perhaps a deeper meaning behind the particular selection of pattern. But that was, I believe, the last question, unless there are any last minute questions. But I believe that might be the last one. So Rachel, if you'd like to,
yeah. I just want to add that, it's so interesting to have this model in dialogue with Margie, you and your work, because it seems like, Shonibare's intervention here is reframing this ship that, illegally and surreptitiously kidnapped Africans and brought them to this country, and restoring it, by changing the all-white sails to this Dutch wax print. It's, signaling the true story behind the ship. It's signaling the sort of hidden history, just as you and your work, your research and your museum is also seeking to uncover this history, to give voice and visibility to both ancestors and descendants alike. It has been such a pleasure to have you here, to hear about your work and research, and I'm so thankful that you were able to share this with our audience today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Margie. Also, please look up Finding Our Roots Museum online, and if you have the opportunity, if you're local, try not to miss the opportunity to see Sea Change, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, will be up through Sunday. But then if you miss it, you won't have to wait very long to see the Yinka Shonibare ship again. But thank you so much, and hope you have a really great rest of your day. Thank you so much, Margie.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.